Welcome to Business Talk. Now, if the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that artificial intelligence is reshaping the economy faster than most of us can keep up with. Feels like every boardroom suddenly has an AI strategy, every startup claims to be AI enabled, and somewhere in the middle of all of that noise sits a very important question about whether or not we are just going through another one of Gartner's hype cycles. There's another critical dimension to this story around data. Whose data are the large language models using? Whose languages and whose societies are shaping the models that increasingly shape the outcomes that then shape our world? And that's really where Africa's voice becomes crucial. My guest today is someone who spent years pushing exactly that agenda, ensuring that AI is not something simply imported into Africa, but it's built in Africa, it's informed by African realities, and really designed to solve African problems. Professor Vukosi Marivate is a director of the African Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Pretoria and the ABSA UP Chair of Data Science. His work really focuses on machine learning and natural language processing. And recently, he was appointed to the UN's Independent International Scientific Panel on AI, one of just 40 experts selected from more than 2,600 global applicants. Remarkable recognition. Professor Maravati, great to chat to you again. And chapeau on being appointed to that panel. For viewers who may not yet have come across the initiative, what exactly is this panel meant to do? And how significant is it that a South African researcher and the University of Pretoria now has a seat at the global table?
Thanks for having me. One thing is that for context is to go back to the first high level. They had a high level advisory panel that worked for a number of years to provide insight, especially after the boom of the current generative AI kind of approaches. And as part of their final recommendations to the UN and the Secretary General in particular was then setting up an independent scientific panel that can bring in evidence, provide insights that do go into the UN, but then obviously then these insights then go to all the member states of the United Nations. And this then flattens some of the knowledge gaps that might be there. Both on the side of bringing in these independent voices, we don't represent the bodies that we might be connected to. We're in there because of our skills, our histories, and obviously the networks that we have to provide this information that they can be used in decision making. AI is at a very interesting time. There is, as you were saying, talking about the Gartner hype cycle, the parts of the technology that will be obviously overhyped, but then inside there are things that can make an impact on people's lives. The question then comes in on how do we make sure that for the things that are good, we keep or we amplify, and the downsides we make sure that people, communities, society can keep those in check and make sure that the governance makes sense.
And those downsides, I mean, they are real. I read over December, if anyone builds it, everyone dies, which sounds kind of like full of hyperbole. But it was, two AI researchers are talking about this pursuit of artificial general intelligence. So they make a very convincing, very cogent argument that we have to be careful about how we develop this technology with the right and requisite guardrails. But one of the things that struck me about your appointment is not just a personal recognition, which is obviously fantastic, but it's a signal about the quality of the research happening here in South Africa. And often we think AI is happening in Silicon Valley. It's maybe happening in China with DeepSeek. What do you think this says about the caliber of AI and data science work coming out of South Africa and the continent more broadly?
Yeah, there's been a lot that was done, that has been going on across the African continent over the last decade or so in building up AI ecosystems. Before that, and still continuing, yes, there's been research in AI in South Africa and across the continent for decades. We do have, if I look at South Africa, that we have a strong research base contextually in the country. We have good internet. We have good electricity, even though South Africans might feel like, that's a hard thing. And we've had these, things like AWS being, like for a long time, having a lot of their technologies also being developed here, like EC2. Um, this then provides that there's a number of researchers in different spaces and not just computing who've been working on the wider development of AI, looking at the impacts of AI, specifically at the University of Pretoria, for example, on that the advisory body that I did say that precedes this independent scientific panel was Prof Amarat Kamblum, right, who's in our philosophy department, and she was one of the people. So going back, was chosen in this space, and she's connected with a number of other UN bodies like UNESCO. And you do find that, right now we're at this point across the country where there's a policy that is coming up to try and also, again, look at the governance and then the opportunities of a lot of the universities now are having AI or data science, either institutes or initiatives that they are putting up. And the reason we also have to think about doing this very well is how then we can connect to each other to increase the strength of our ecosystem, right? It's really not enough just to think about one university, but then thinking about this ecosystem that we're building that can then move us into more heavier R&D. The heavier R&D in these spaces, what does it give us? Not just the technology development, but then also this information that assists in governance and reducing the downsides. And because then you have people who are looking at these things, and we're hoping that this is also then what's happening across the African continent as well. It's still a challenge in terms of just having R&D. You can't just buy these technologies off the shelf. I think people just think, oh, that we'll just take them in, but it's really hard to then say we're going to get the maximum out of them. At the same time, we're going to maximally protect ourselves from some of the negative effects. And that's why, going back to your point about the researchers that are speaking on some of these downsides, it requires you like a very deep understanding and then being able to inform the public. And then that then moves the governance processes forward. It's never really in a black box.
Absolutely. It's so interesting. We're having this conversation after I was chatting to Professor Johannes Slubber, also at University of Pretoria, about nuclear power development. And he says, much of the pushback against nuclear power also it comes from fear, and that fear is based on a misunderstanding, or especially with this complex science or complex technology. We look at these things, many people from the outside, it's a black box, a large language model. We can't explain how it delivers things that feel intelligent. So that's what you're trying to do at the panel, aiming to help countries separate the AI hype from the real science grounded insight. What role will you personally play in this kind of early warning mechanism, and why is so rigorous a scientific analysis so important?
Yeah, some of my work personally as a researcher has been looking especially at the intersection of African languages and AI systems. We continue expanding within my research group at the university, from not just looking at just the text or the audio, but then we will probably go into more modalities connected to kind of different media. And at the kind of at the same time, connected with a startup company called Lilapa AI, where we're looking at now taking language and making it infrastructure that people can then use to connect people and reach organization stakeholders, right? We have 2,000 plus languages on the African continent. So this is experience of, hey, to do this well, you require good ways to deal with what we sometimes call low resource scenarios. You don't have as much data. You might not have as much compute. You need to be more efficient, right? And you need to take into account what is the context that you're releasing models or developing models. It's not enough to dump a model and then just say it will work. I think this comes into some of the thinking and engagements we've been having, for example, at the lab at the university with people like the Department of Basic Education. The reason we're interested in growing some of these either collaborations or really partnerships is on that path of say, if like we have an opportunity that there could be very impactful ways that AI comes into education via the lens of language. But then what are the things that kind of are barriers in those areas? And those are not simply technical, right? It then becomes what's happening in the classroom, how the teachers are equipped, and all of those things. And we can then sit and also listen, and then through that work on solutions that are much more contextual to that, instead of just saying, well, it can also do education, so it it should just work, and that's not how it actually ends up happening.
Because, as you say, much of the world's AI today is trained on data sets that overwhelmingly reflect Western languages, Western cultural ideas and contexts, maybe Asian as well. Certainly not many that reflect the African language and African reality. So, what risks do we face if African data and African languages are not represented in the development of these models? Is it just that we then miss out on the opportunity to exploit them in areas like education, or does it run deeper than that?
So there's also could be different reasons why the digitization of a language, for example, is not at the level that it's just easy for um, uh, AI or natural language processing researchers to just be able to pick up data and then run something through. So understanding those social technical challenges is important, and that's what I think a number of us will be bringing into the panel itself, into going and say, like, how do you come up with either policy interventions to really deal with some of these pieces. So it's not just simply the language not being there, but then what leads to the language not being available in an area. And that study is not simply, again, a computing science. We work, for example, with people in our African languages department, linguists. We would work with people in law to figure out the legal challenges that it comes to data being available, and then other organizations, if we have to do data collection or better representing these languages across. The other thing I think people should think about when it comes to this is that now, if you have the development just continuing, it compounds, right? So at the beginning, it might look like, oh, there's just a small gap, but then as more and more of the kind of popular features keep on getting better and bigger, right now we're in this agentic kind of wave that is going on, because at the beginning you had this gap. It keeps on kind of getting bigger and bigger, and it then sometime will get to a point it feels intractable. But a number of people have been working to try and reduce these gaps, but it needs, you need more. I would always say you need 100 more of people like myself being available on somewhere like on the African continent to make it a much more impact in saying, hey, we can actually do this locally. And that's going to be a big thing. Can you do this here in South Africa yourselves? Because by doing that, it means that you have the capability and capacity that even in future technological developments, you can make those changes, right? In the same way, as you said about Prof. Johan, if you can't build a nuclear power station, right? Then saying, oh, here's the next part, whether it's fusion or if you don't have that capability and capacity, you then always playing this catch up, and just thinking that you'll do fast catch up or skip becomes harder and harder over time.
Yeah, there's almost that educational debt that compounds over time that is almost impossible to leapfrog. Institutional knowledge systems, processes that have to be put in place, and ultimately, if we are to see Africa thrive and succeed, this is the area of the future. These are the arteries of the new economy, which brings us to the work that you're doing at the African Institute for Data Science and AI, AfriDSAI. I think that's the acronym, or FRIDSAI. I
Yes.
don't know how you say it at the University of Pretoria. You lead it. It's not just theoretical work that you guys are doing there. There's some very real initiatives. Take me through some of the work that you're doing in the ecosystem.
Yes, so we've started this institute over the last year or so, and where we are right now is at that startup phase. We've just announced last week our first 20 fellows, and it's an interesting mix all the way from our education faculty, law faculty, humanities, health, and what is it, natural and agriculture and agricultural sciences and engineering and the built environment and IT. So across the university, so you do have people who are looking at applications of AI. About a week, like I think 2 weeks ago, there's a big project that was launched by one of the fellows, Dr. Giogo Gori, looking at the intersections of IP and AI, right? This is a major part of thinking about the data situation of how does intellectual property play a part in these spaces? The reason you explore these again topics is not simply on the one side you would have heard about artists or writers talking about, hey, how is my content being used and ingested into these systems. At the same time, also for researchers as they're working on their solutions, how do they then use IP as a way either to enable more resources to come into the ecosystem? These are things that require specialized work that then can provide insights both sides. It's actually not just on one side of this equation. What we hope, for example, is being able to also create innovations in these areas. We want to be able to bring in a lot of talent into the university to build up innovations that are responsible and sustainable. We want to be a place that also drives the ecosystem here locally. I'll give an example of just some of the things I want to see more of in again relation to that data issue. One of the challenges that some of the systems, when they actually have to go in and look at data, let's say you have the internet and trying to identify where you could find a language like Siswati, has been things like, do you have tools that can I help you identify a specific language? And you might find that these tools are not available. So how then do you do the innovations to build up those tools? And it can help researchers then be able to filter content in a way that then allows them that you can make cleaner data. Because if you don't do that, as you said, more than 55% of just more general internet data is in English. And then when you come to the African continent, it would be like less than 1%, right? For 50, 54, 55 African countries. And we want to look at those types of things and say, like, oh, what are the similar types of things that might be blocking like progress in AI and agriculture or AI and health, and AI and X in those spaces, and trying to then contextualize them to assist in unlocking those parts of the university to make impact in those areas.
Fascinating. Jeepers, we could chat for hours, Vukosi, because there's so much to unpack here. In the media industry, we watch the IP story very closely. I think the New York Times is suing several of the the large language model companies, and again on the IP issue, because that hasn't quite been sorted out. So all of this stuff is so new and evolving. But I think one area that really is close to all of our hearts in South Africa is education, and probably an area where we look at AI and think, wow, there has to be a big opportunity. I just see it with my own daughters in the way they interact with ChatGPT, for example, and they sometimes bring home stuff that is maths that I haven't done in 30 years. So I defer to ChatGPT on some of the questions, but they use it, they interact with it, they can quiz it, and I think it's probably one of the areas where AI could have the most immediate and visible impact. But teachers, I think, are grappling with students using AI tools, sometimes productively, sometimes creatively, occasionally to write essays that are suspiciously polished. So, how do you see AI and large language models transforming the way we teach and learn, particularly when it comes to personalized learning and adapting to different learning styles and languages?
Yeah, this is something that we're also, I think, as a university, all going through, or the whole higher education and basic education spaces is looking at the impact of these technologies. On one side, it looks like, hey, you now have at your fingertips things that look like personalized tutors. But at the same time, one of the things that for people just to understand, as you said, like technology keeps on moving forward. When the internet generally became available, minus broadband access and all those things, it was hailed as this great equalizer that information will be at your fingertips, and as such, it will level the playing field, and that has proven not to be enough, right? Sure, there will be things that change. We don't really talk about encyclopedias anymore necessarily, or having an encyclopedia set in your house, right? That's a change. But then at the same time, the equal, like saying, hey, people who will move all up and then we'll get to it. But that's not really what happened. And this then requires again understanding the socio-technical pieces that led to that. And in the same way, AI is it requires that, or people have been working in these spaces to then find and say, like, okay, yeah, sure. There is going to be one of saying, what are the opportunities if you were to look at a local language plus an AI system that could assist in maybe localizing some of the way that you do content delivery. But then you have to then think and say, like, what is the home situation in such a way that that becomes useful? Or what's the situation in the classroom? What's shown as actually having the efficacy. And this, being a researcher myself, then brings up, I'll say, like, we need researchers in education and AI who work and figure those things out. It is not simply just because the AI is there, it will improve that. And there have been a lot of tries of thinking about education and technology. Sure, they require some sort of basis of just the environment to work out. But it is exciting on on many fronts. At the same time, we then have to kind of go through this calculator moment, right? Of saying what might have happened when the calculator became generally available to people, and then you're thinking about what are the skills that you need to keep for arithmetic, right? And that might have changed, and now in the same thing that you have AI, it like this great tooling. I'm also finding personally that for things that I'm trying to learn, I can now set up ways that look at how how I have an interest in specific things, but it's a cheat in one way. I am a university professor. I've done a PhD. It's almost like I have some qualities of having learned how to learn, and that is not necessarily what everybody has. You must know why you're learning something and pushing yourselves. And these are things that maybe go back to the cause, or say, are we teaching the core skills that allow that our young people actually then, can be the critical contributors to our countries or society? And it's not really whether it's a technology or these other things. And that's another part of maybe having AI systems, that it's highlighting that we have these gaps that were already there. It's not that they came up because AI. It's just that we were either evaluating or teaching in such a way that we thought was efficacious, but then had these gaps. And now the AI is just highlighting and making those gaps much more clear.
It's such a great point that you raise there, because I think increasingly it does raise all manner of interesting questions about the model of education and how we teach. What are the skills? Are we teaching the skills that are going to be required for this AI world, which is the skill of learning, to your point, to be able to assimilate learning and to develop that higher agency so that you don't become lazy. And I do think there have been global studies showing a plateauing of global cognitive ability that kind of aligns with the arrival of ChatGPT as well. And so we need to guard against that. At the same time, in a country like South Africa, where we have such high levels of unemployment, the labor market has particular context. We're going to see some jobs change, some might disappear entirely, new categories might even emerge. So, what then therefore do you see as the role of the university, your institution, in preparing the next generation of Africa for an economy that's increasingly shaped by AI?
I think there's two ways to think about it. The universities are going through a time of change. We've I think a few weeks also ago had to sit in on our university's community of practice for AI, and just providing these insights that people are upskilling kind of themselves in these areas so that they can better serve the student populations that are coming in. It's a reality, as you're saying, right? So you can't ignore it. And that will continue, and we hope, the researchers that are here will continue working in the areas that they are making an impact on. And we just want, from the institute's perspective, to just provide that kind of foundational layer and connective tissue in terms of the bridges between, so that then really people can look at this from a societal point of view. On the other side, it's to make sure we inform policymakers, decision makers on the roles they have to play. We spent time last year at the G20 AI Task Force and the Digital Economy Working Group. And one of the reasons of doing that is thinking that AI is going, as you're saying, cross-sectoral in terms of its impact. And some of that is looking at labor, looking at competition, looking at, yes, communication and digital technologies, science, technology, DSTI, education. All of these places are all going to have or continue looking at what the impact of AI is going to be on their sectors. And if we're not providing the experts, right, within our research or ecosystem, or academic ecosystems into the country, it just makes us all poorer in the long term. So there is a big part that universities have to play, and the institute is working to make sure on our side we can do as much as possible to inform, and then through that really make an impact on South African society.
And maybe we need to have a follow-up interview with Professor Rutger-Bloom as well, because I think there is a deeper question around, and it's not a technical question so much as a philosophical question around what are the human values that become important, because the more these systems become embedded in your daily life, the more they shape our decision making. And I get emails that look like suspiciously like they've been written by AI and all of that. I mean, it's integrating daily into society. So what do you think are the human values that we absolutely must hold on to in a world that is increasingly infused with artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I think it is a major point. One of the major milestones we reached this year, outside having now this UN independent panel, was having the AI summit, the India AI Impact Summit in Delhi. And for me, having spent just that time, is like these themes of human flourishing, and also it making sure that AI represents us and improves happiness. I think that's what one of the things that they were were on the billboards in those spaces. And I think the reason that they really use some of these themes was to highlight to people that you need to provide the input. Right. Well, how do you get to that? It is not enough just to say the technology actually exists, but it's now working towards the shaping. And this shaping goes both ways. Yes, some of these technologies come to your fingertips, they do change you. Right. It is not uniquely an AI situation. Some of the things that, I still in huge discussions and thinking about the supply chains, right? What does it actually take to build up AI systems, or what does it actually impact with these AI systems, all the way from you might be having to dig up cobalt in the DRC, and what does that mean when now you have an acceleration of we're having to build bigger and bigger data centers. It is not simply just a data center existing. There will be lots of discussions about the impacts of data that data centers might have. There's things like content moderation or annotation of data, and the ethical and responsible parts of that. And then there's these labor effects that are going to actually go in. As you said, it's not just the technology piece. And the technology piece is probably in some ways looks like a small slice, given the rest of the societal impact that this actually is having. It is not something of the future. And that's something maybe for listeners to get, is that this is something that now is going back decades. It's just that it's just front and center now because you're seeing it. But AI, machine learning is decades old, and this was coming along. I think you can probably go back 10, 15 years ago to some of the economics papers that were talking about what happens if this actually just takes off.
It absolutely on that point. If you just look at human language, and I mean, it's what you do. We use language like something is hard coded into us, or we use the language of technology to describe what being human is. And there has been this great merging of the two realms that predate the mass use of artificial intelligence. I mean, you've worked in the field, so you've been using it for far longer than most of us who only really got our hands dirty with large language models. But we have been really infusing the technology speak, and so I think we're a world that is primed to really think very deeply about what it means to be human in a world where technology is so day to day. I just want to end off on a bit of a light note with you, Vukosi, because I think one of the most entertaining parts of these language models is watching them try to interpret idioms and cultural nuance. The English model strength, they struggle with sarcasm. Heaven help them with African proverbs. So in your
Yeah.
work building models for African language, what's an idiom or proverb or a phrase that completely confused the system? And did you manage to eventually get the machine to understand?
I might have a ready-made example for that, but it is something. Even I think, just imagine that, even like just thinking about South African English as a context, that you can mix and not, like let's say, sentiment of reading somebody writing something and then saying like, oh, is this bad or is it actually good? And you see this of like, oh, this doesn't compute, right? Because you might not have enough examples that the machine has seen in the past. Interestingly, both on the side of idioms or proverbs, we do have some students. We have a project that's running called AI for the African Languages Lab, and we have a master's student who's specifically looking at isiZulu idioms and proverbs and trying to get the systems to be much better at actually being able to process and interpret what actually is being is being written about. And I do have another student who's then also looking at finding ways to also better interpret memes, right? Of saying what are, like a meme that you see, what are, like, how is it contextually being used? We tend to say in some of this work that we kind of look at language as where it is and how it's being used, and doing that again, whether in some of our work that people do across the university on things like misinformation and disinformation challenges, understanding a use of a idiom or a use of a meme contextually is important in likely building up better safeguards against things, because you also don't want to have a system that unfairly flags something because the machine couldn't understand what was you put. But then at the same time, you don't want people to be hiding kind of meaning that could be flare up things that society does not want, just because they can hide it in these types of things that might look like innuendo if you didn't understand what was going on.
It's very tricky, but very interesting at the same time. Professor Vukosi
Yeah.
Marivate, thank you. Director of the African Institute of Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Pretoria, and now a proud member of the United Nations Independent International Scientific Panel on AI. Thanks for a great conversation on the evolution of AI here on Business Talk and the important role that we have to play in shaping it as African researchers in the development of artificial intelligence. Thanks so much for your time.
Okay. Thank you.